As I edit the footage for this video and the end of this project approaches, it's only now that I have some time to reflect upon the origins of this project. At times, the destiny of this project seemed out of reach and almost beyond my grasp. Then I intercepted an idea.
It's yours now.
And through my hands, that idea formed itself into what you see before you. This became the inspirational pendulum that swung in to regulate my movements and become the linchpin for this multi-part construction journey. It was this imagery that triggered the spark that reignited the fuse that led to the continuation, then ultimately the completion of this project. But where did the inspiration for this linchpin originate? My plan is to examine this question and others in this 5th installment of the Build series featuring this illuminated manifestation. During the introduction of this video, I mentioned that the circular feature on the table's top became the linchpin of the design around which the rest of the table developed. The following is what I typed out on my phone immediately after I roughly sketched out said linchpin. Quote, "This is a project that was set aside to allow other projects to make their way into existence. Coming up with the design for the top was very much a product of perseverance. I'm glad I stuck with it though, because as I began drawing the top, I realized that what I was drawing was inspired and I started shaking." End quote. After what I just quoted, I paused my involuntary movements and captured that reaction. A physical reaction, as I just described, happens to me quite often, not only when I design objects, but also when I'm composing music. So it got me thinking, is this an experience that any of you watching can relate to? Please leave a comment. When designing something, questions always arise, questions that are laced with doubts. Throughout this entire project, doubts have attempted to compromise my commitment to bringing this table into existence. Before the tabletop design arrived in my mind's eye, I'd gone through multiple iterations of designing the table's top. Sketch after sketch was rejected until a winning design appeared. Then I took that surviving sketch and set it out at scale. Although I'm setting it out 1:1 scale, it only requires that I concentrate on 1/4 of the set out due to the intentional symmetry of the design. Years of fathering really pay off when a well-trained third arm is deployed to lend assistance in what would otherwise be a difficult moment. Thanks, son. I'll take a more detailed approach and look at the separate components that make up the entire table's top in the next video. The focus of this video is the design at the core of the table's top. The origins of the design are unknown. Perhaps it's a result of over 50 years of accumulated experience and influence. Or perhaps it's something else entirely. I may never know, but it's a thought I like to explore. Anyway, I think I have something to say from the workshop. Alright, so to make this shape as close to symmetrical as possible, I took the original piece, cut a quarter out of it, and then I've just repeated it like so. Obviously I've just lined everything up carefully. Then I've just flush trimmed this section, and then I'll put that section over there, flush trim that section there, flush trim that. Then I end up with one solid piece. Now I can set this piece aside, continue on with the rest of the design. This will actually line up with that. That's what I'm going to continue to set out. Now I'm going to move on to these sections here. It's in sections like that I get the impression that I'm just thinking out loud. As I said, the main focus of this video is the central section of the tabletop. So let's continue. As with all the other components that feature within the table's design, it first begins with a scale drawing. After a satisfactory scale and adequate amount of precision has been achieved, I like to go over it all with an indelible marker. This is so I can safely erase unnecessary markings that have the potential to distract and send me off course as I make voids between the components. Once complete, the drawing is then separated to yield at least 1 or 2 usable sections. Ultimately, one of these sections will be close to symmetrical. Because of this symmetry, that component becomes a repeatable pattern that'll form the entire design. So if my set out is adequate, When I've separated and selected the winning sections, those pieces will be used to make templates. After I've used those templates to form the individual brass components, if all goes well, when I assemble the brass components, it should resemble the original setout. If it's not already obvious, what I'm making now will eventually be used to make a set of templates. These templates will then be used to shape 2mm brass plate into metal components that will surround and embrace recessed lighting. Part of making something like this for the first time is figuring out how to maximize the use of one section without drastically compromising the original design. With that being part of my approach, I decided it'd be more efficient and less problematic to condense the two smaller sections into one component. Then I only have to contend with 2 templates. It also reduces the amount of holes to drill. To clear my head, I ride my mountain bike several times a week. While on these rides, I often find materials that are laying on the road after being flung from a moving vehicle. This careless style of driving does have its benefits though. On one particular ride, I found a gang of nails. As soon as I saw them, I knew exactly how I could incorporate them into this project. These road finds were used on multiple components of this project as displayed here. As you can see, I used the found nails to pin the 3mm cutouts in place. Then I traced the cutouts with a flush trim bit to generate a durable template from 16mm MDFs. It worked well. To avoid destroying the brass sections or having to repeat this time-consuming feature, I spent a considerable amount of time to ensure the brass would stay firmly fixed on the template. But most of all, I wanted it to be safe. Well, safe enough. The pinholes were filled with M4 threaded inserts. The plan was then to attach the brass plate with pre-drilled holes positioned to correspond with the threaded inserts. Countersunk M4 bolts would then hold the brass plate to the template. In my mind, this seemed like a good approach to holding the brass in place. So when the brass has been shaped, I would simply undo the bolts, attach the next brass blank and swiftly generate multiple components. Unfortunately, it didn't work as planned, so I scrapped the idea, compromised and settled on a different technique. After 12 sections of 2mm brass were roughly released from their plate formation, each section then had as much surplus material removed as possible with hand files as I crept up on the final shape, leaving only a small amount of material to finally remove. Once I'd figured out how to safely secure the brass sections to the template, I then moved over to a specially dedicated router setup and removed the remaining material with an old flush trim router bit. Because these brass components contribute to the main central feature of the tabletop, my objective was clear from the start: achieve subjective perfection, or at least a standard I can live with. This technique worked better than expected, with surprising results. The 2 different templates successfully generated uniformly shaped brass components, and again, I was pleased. Okay. Now I can move on to the next section of the build. My approach to creating what will be the central focal point for the table's top was relatively straightforward. Using one Merbu plank, then observing the intended shape for this timber, I managed to harvest the design from one plank in a manner that maximised the yield. Then using floating tenons, I could simply and effectively align the joining surfaces. After a quick yet effective glue up, I cleaned up and prepared the timber blank. This is a 12mm duplicate of the 3mm template I made earlier. I used the template as a drill bit guide to penetrate the timber below, leaving two carefully placed 3mm holes to accommodate the CCG's central pivot point. Then again, I turned to the router table equipped with a spiral flush trim bit. Flush trimming was a relatively swift process. Upon reflection, I'm thankful for the time that went into generating this template that made this process very rewarding. After using a guide I made off camera to hold the brass components in the desired formation, setting out, then centre punching the positions of the fixture holes was simple. Once these points have been drilled and countersunk, these same holes will ultimately house the polished brass fixings to hold the components in their final position. The position of these holes is an integral part of aligning with the aesthetic I'm chasing for this design. Now, utilising the 3mm hole that I specifically placed earlier, I then deployed another template I made off camera and held it in place using, you guessed it, it's another one of those road-found nails. This template uses the 3mm hole as a 0 point from which the layout of the brass components is predicated. With the template aligned with the centre of the timber component, it's now a simple task of placing the brass components in position and fixing them in place, then using a sharp instrument severing the timber fibres around them. Once a clean impression of the brass components was made, I then removed the brass and prepared for the next step of this operation. Okay, so as you can see, I've put in a couple of visual stopping points just so I can see the router bit and stop hopefully before I go past any of these points. This is the first time I've done this. It's probably a little more complicated than it needs to be, but I enjoy it. So I'm just going to dive right in and have a crack at it, see how I go. In order to have more control over this procedure, I brought out and dusted off a CCG that I made many years ago that was inspired by some old guy on YouTube. Unfortunately, I can't remember who it was, so I'm unable to provide a link. Perhaps I could search my history, but who has time for such things? This guide was made to accommodate the plunge accessory for this router. This accessory provides me with the ability to perform cleaner surface entry and exit with the cutting bit, along with greater depth control. With the majority of the material removed, I had now gained well-defined access to the timber's subsurface. This access presented me with an opportunity for even greater definition, or high definition. With a sharp chisel in hand, I located the previously marked out lines, then the lines simply guided the chisel to remove surplus material. After a very focused chiseling session concluded, I confirmed the fit of the brass components, drilled out the fixing holes, and moved on. Now all I had left to do was to transfer the 3mm hole to the opposite surface of the timber. Then once again using the CCG, I began the process of creating recessed openings for the lights that are to be housed below. This first diameter and plunge cut created a circular recess to accommodate the outside diameter of the cylinders that will house the lights. With the table's central timber component prepared, it's only now that I see that this mirrored design on the timber background is reminiscent of the symbol for infinity. This observation may be a symbolic representation of the years that the project has been spread across. Anyway, while I have your attention on this feature, it may interest you that this section of the build was commenced on Sunday the 20th of October 2024 at approximately 3:32 p.m. Using a very small offcut of 6mm opal acrylic sheet, I set the depth of the router guide. This plunge cut and diameter will accommodate the opal disc shown here. This process involves cutting different depths and diameters, as there are different components that require different allowances. If these components are to be successfully integrated into this design, then a reasonable amount of precision is required. Now, before I go too far and completely remove the center, which would also remove the vital central pivot point for the router guide, I first need to make the timber cylinders that I've spoken of that will be fitted with LED lights. If that makes sense to you, great, let's move on. I had an old sheet of 19mm Baltic birch plywood in storage, so using the plywood was both a calculated and an opportunistic move. It presented me with a moment to raid the supplies and withdraw the stored plywood. After a few measurements had been taken, the next move was to cut out a ring with the appropriate outer and inner diameters. Once I'd released the ring from its restraints, I confirmed the fit in the circular recess I created earlier. Now that I'd verified the ring's size, it was then used to trace out duplicates on the remaining plywood blanks. After gaining access to the inner circle via a casually placed 10mm entrance hole, the circles were easily gutted with the jigsaw. Then I piled them up and prepared the batch for processing at the bandsaw. After the cutting, I could then glue on one layer to each ring, allow it to cure, then trim off the excess at the router table. This process was repeated until the original ring-like form had been extruded into strong cylindrical structures. Once enough height had been reached, I could then move on to making the aluminium inserts to be housed within them, but I need to make a few more adjustments to the cylinders first. Those adjustments are to reduce the height and cut off a 25mm section. Once separated, the two cylindrical components will receive rebates, but I'll get to that later. First I need to flatten these surfaces, then make some aluminium gobos. This hand-drawn 3mm template was duplicated several times to produce more substantial templates and a backup or two. Those templates were then used to generate different components on this project that feature this organic-looking design. After cutting aluminium blanks, it was really just the same procedure I've used in previous videos to achieve the organic web look, only this time I'm using 1.6mm aluminium and 3 carefully positioned 3mm holes. I used a few more road-found nails and some double-sided tape to secure the aluminium to the template. Then I took it outside where I'd set up a simple router table. I lowered the RPMs of the router as I find it generates less heat and prevents the aluminium from clogging up the bit. And once again I used an old flush trim bit. Back indoors I used one of the gobos to set the height of the bearing guided rebate bit. Then I simply applied rebates to the plywood cylinders I made earlier. Using a few more nails, I segmented them to be used as location pins. Then I cleaned up and rounded over one end of each pin to prepare them to be easily driven into each hole. Then using a deburring tool I cleaned up the gobos and took everything to the bench drill. Off camera I drilled 3mm holes through the upper layer all the way through, leaving a shallow hole in the lower layer. This array of pins will ultimately locate and return the top section of the cylinder to its original position, only this time it will feature a layer of aluminium between the upper and lower sections. As the end of this video approaches, it's at this point of the build I'd like to impart some thoughts. Throughout my life I've often thought about what an idea is, especially when I turn some of those ideas into sounds or objects. When it comes to producing a physical object such as this project, it gets me thinking. When I design, then make something, I am in fact downloading and embedding my ideas and thoughts into that physical object. I believe I'm producing a record of those ideas that were contemporaneous during the project's development and construction. Each object I create is encoded with my existence. I don't know about you, but for me, from time to time and seemingly from out of nowhere, I find myself pondering the origins of ideas. When it comes to the visions that ultimately will generate an object, at the time the idea occurs, I don't question it. I take the inspired idea and I just get busy making that vision. It's only later, when the project nears completion, I have time to consider the origin of that idea. These ideas may have been brought here within me when I was born and lay dormant, waiting until I developed sufficient skills to express these ideas through my hands into a physical representation of these thoughts. Or perhaps the justifying reason I made these illuminated portholes was inspired by a thought I had about the origin of ideas. I believe these reflective thoughts dovetail well with the various illuminated elements featured and concealed beneath this project's surface. A concealed feature of the tabletop's portholes are what's contained within the recessed holding cells beneath the portholes. Electrified LED strips emit light that is intercepted and manipulated by gobos that feature organic shapes. Then those organically shaped emissions are projected through an opaque membrane, which creates a sense of movement. Perhaps this movement was inspired by a primordial secretion that, through an unknown process, attached itself to a signal that was then transmitted into my mind, where receptors caught it and it was interpreted as an idea. From there, that idea was born or downloaded into existence through my skills that were developed over many years, resulting in my ability to interact and manipulate materials within the physical realm. To me, a thought or an idea is a potential power source that generates energy in the form of inspiration that then generates motivation, resulting in manifestation. At times I feel like a human 3D printing machine, printing ideas that present themselves in my imagination to be born into our existence. My question is, are humans vessels in which ideas pass through to exist? If an idea is to exist in the human realm, then I'd say yes. Then that leads me to think, do ideas exist without humans? I don't know, perhaps I've been overthinking these ideas and I should just accept things the way they are, without question.